So, hello and welcome to our presentation this evening, Eerie, Muncie, Tales from the Dark Side of Local History. This is a community collaboration between the Ball State University Libraries, Delaware County Historical Society, Minnetrista, and the Muncie Public Library. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available in the Ball State University Digital Media Repository. As a disclaimer, this program includes content that is meant for a mature audience and it contains disturbing content. It is meant for a PG-13 audience. So first, some housekeeping rules. You are free to have your video on, but given the number of participants that we are expected to have this evening, it will help with the bandwidth if you turn off your videos. For the time being, we have muted everybody. There will be time for questions between each segment and at the end of the presentation. If you wish to ask a question, you can use the chat box. The button to access the chat is located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Using the chat, when using the chat box, please make sure that the to field is labeled to everyone. This way, all participants can see the question. If you wish to ask your question verbally, we will ask that you raise your hand. This function is also in the toolbar under the Participants button. If you click Participants, a blue box will open up with a list of names. There you can raise your hand by clicking the blue Raise Your Hand button, and I will unmute you so you can ask your question. Right now, I'm going to ask if anyone who can and is able to enter into the chat that you can hear us and see our presentation slide right now. Okay, we've got several people, so I think that we are good to move forward. So let's start with some introductions. I'm Sara, Allison, the head of Archives User Engagement at Ball State University Libraries, Archives and Special Collections, and I will be your moderator. This evening, we're going to be hearing from Melissa Gentry, who is the supervisor in the GIS Research and Map Collection at Ball State University Libraries and one of the founders of the Notable Women of Muncie and Delaware County Committee for the Delaware County Historical Society. Karen Brown Good is the interim director of the Delaware County Historical Society and also one of the founding members of the Notable Women of Muncie and Delaware County Committee. Sara McKinley is the local history and genealogy supervisor of Muncie Public Library and manager of the Carnegie Library. And Karen Vincent is the director of special projects at Minnetrista, president of the Delaware County Historical Society, and one of the founding members of the Notable Women of Muncie and Delaware County Committee. So let's give them all a virtual round of applause. Yay! Okay, so we are going to go ahead and move on to our first presenter, Karen. Karen, I think.
Okay, am I on now?
You are now, yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Lavina Jones Black is who I'm going to be talking about this evening. Lavina and her revenge, to be specific. The life of Lavina Black is an example of a story of a woman who had really great courage and I feel a lot of mental strength. It all started on September the 13th, 1898, when she heard her front door open. Lavina quickly laid down her mending that she was working on and started to her door. Next slide. John Bailey, her neighbor, started in the door. He started approaching her with a wild look in his eyes. He kept advancing toward her. She began screaming for help. John was described as being 6 foot tall and weighing 140 pounds. There was nothing that Lavina could do as he drug her into her bedroom and shoved her onto the bed. When he was finished with her, he left the house and Lavina rushed out to find her husband. When she found her husband, though, she realized she couldn't say anything to him about the rape. Instead, she tried her best to go about her business as usual. About 2 or 3 weeks later, while she was washing dishes at the kitchen sink, She looked out the window and saw Mr. Bailey approaching the window. He stepped up to the window and informed Lavina that she'd better not tell anybody about what had happened. He continued to tell her that if she did tell anyone, he would chloroform her and set her house on fire, burning her along with the house. Lavina was so frightened that she couldn't say or do anything. When her husband returned that night, she realized she had to tell him. She ran to him, threw her arms around his neck. Crying, she told what Bailey had done to her and the threat that he had made earlier that day. Lavina at that point was determined to report the rape and have Bailey arrested. Her husband, though, tried to talk her out of doing this. That night, her husband took her to his parents' house, where they told her in-laws what had happened. John's parents agreed with John that she should keep quiet about the assault and not say anything. But Lavina was determined to have justice. The next day, she went to the police and filed charges. One thing I want you to keep in mind at this point was this is in the year of 1898. The next slide, please. Bailey was arrested and put on trial. Mayor Toohey heard the preliminary trial. Bailey's main witness was a man named William Henry Coffin. He testified that he and John Bailey were together from the morning of the 13th until the evening of the 14th, that they had driven to Muncie on the morning of the 13th, spent the day together, spent the night, then went to look at a horse that John was thinking about buying before returning home. Since Bailey was with William all day long, and the next day also, he couldn't have been with Lavina, and he couldn't have done what she was accusing him of doing. So he was found not guilty of the crime. When Lavina heard that, we'll go to our next slide, please. She was so weak that it was necessary that she be assisted to the carriage. Her sister-in-law stayed with her for the better part of the week after the acquittal. During that week, Lavina saw Bailey pass the road twice. Each time she was filled with terror at the sight of him. Later that week, John and Lavina went to her parents' home for supper. Lavina saw a revolver laying on her father's bureau. She picked it up. Holding it in her hand made her feel safe. She loaded the gun and put it in her pocket. She was determined to keep it with her at all times. Next slide, please. On the morning of November 4th, 1898, Lavina was in the kitchen when she realized she needed some water to cook some beans for supper. Having no well at her home, she grabbed a bucket from beside the sink and started walking to Smith's child's home where she could get some water from his well. As she walked through the gate, she realized that Mr. Smith was in the yard talking to a couple of men, but she didn't pay any attention as to who it was. She went straight to the well, filled up her and turned around to leave. That was when she saw that one of the people that Smith was talking to was John Bailey. Instead of going home, she set the bucket on the ground and began walking towards Bailey. When she was within 6 feet of him, she drew her revolver from her apron and began firing. Bailey fell to the ground, and Lavina turned around, walked back to the house, and went home. And the newspaper reports reported, one of them said that she had fired 3 times. The other one said she'd completely emptied the revolver that day. Next slide, please. When she reached home, her husband was in the barn, and she told him what had happened. So he hitched up the horse and started to drive to Muncie. They got as far as Kamak when they saw Superintendent Cashmere and Officer Ball, who had been dispatched to the scene. Cashmere asked Mr. Black to get in the car with Officer Ball, and Cashmere got into the carriage with Lavina and started towards Muncie. On the way to the jail, which I found this part a little interesting, they stopped at Wirt's to eat dinner. It was reported that Lavina ate a hearty meal and spent the afternoon at headquarters in the chief's private room without shedding a tear. The grand jury in the Bailey Black case charged Lavina with murder in first degree on November 17, 1898. The trial began in December. According to the Muncie Evening News, December 19, 1898, the courtroom was filled during the preliminary portion of, quote, the greatest murder trial ever held in the circuit court, unquote. At the table for the defense sat Lavina, her husband John, their 8-year-old daughter, and Mr. and Mrs. Snodgrass. And Mr. and Mr. Snodgrass were a couple that had raised John. The defense entered the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Next slide, please. At the murder trial, Lavina had to relive the assault as she testified on her own behalf. She explained how Bailey had burst in the door, how he kept advancing towards her. She had to go over every detail of what he had done. She also explained how she had seen Bailey 2 or 3 weeks later when he passed the kitchen window as she was washing dishes. She told the jury about the threat he had made, and she went on to say that when her husband returned home, she had told him everything. Next slide, please. She talked about the day of the murder and how she needed some water to cook some beans. She stated that she remembered going to the well and she remembered pumping the water. But the next thing that she remembered, she was at the gate where Bailey was leaning. She said she remembered nothing else from that point until the next day when her cousin Charles Rollins was talking to her at the jail. The biggest surprise during the trial was when William Henry Coffin took the stand. William, remember, was the person that had been at Bailey's alibi for the rape trial, and he had testified that he and Bailey had been together the day of the assault. Well, during the trial for murder, he testified for the defense, and he testified that he must have been mistaken. He stated that at the trial that he was at the home of William Gray in Harrison Township that day to see a sick child. And on the morning of the 14th, he had come to Muncie to purchase a casket for that child and then returned to William Gray's home when the child died. The date, he said, of the purchase of the casket is available to prove that he had not been with John Bailey on the day of the rape. In the murder trial, he said, I must have been mistaken. And he desired to correct his testimony given in the mayor's court during the rape trial. Next slide, please. At 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve, 1898, sent to the jury, and in less than 30 minutes, a verdict of not guilty was reached. After the verdict was read, the members of the jury walked over to where the defendant sat, and each one shook her hand. It was later discovered that the first vote taken regarding the guilt of the accused was unanimous for acquittal. Lavina Black walked out of the courtroom accompanied by her husband and family, a free woman. And that's all I have on that.
Thank you, Karen. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and add them into the chat, or if you want to ask a question verbally, raise your hand. I do have one question that I'd like to ask. Did Coffin, the gentleman who gave the false testimony about the whereabouts of John Bailey, and then he testified in favor or for the defense, was he ever held accountable for lying during the first trial?
I wasn't able to find anything about that. I used the newspapers.com to get a lot of this information. I'm assuming I'd have to go to court some way or another, but I don't really know.
Okay, and we do have someone who has their hand raised, and I'm going to go ahead and see. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Oh, Anna, I'm sorry, it doesn't look like it's allowing me. Can you unmute yourself to ask your question?
I did not have my hand raised. I clicked the clapping hands icon.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is going to be Karen Vincent.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, there it is.
Okay. So my story isn't particularly eerie, but it is weird and it's definitely icky. So let's go to the first slide here. So in 1913, 3 men from Muncie all suffered from digestive issues. They were former congressman and lawyer George Cromer, John Fitzgibbons, president of Muncie Ornamental Iron Company, and Harry W. Long, a lawyer and prosecuting attorney. Mr. Cromer thought that his ailment was quite serious, and Mr. Fitzgibbons felt so bad that he wasn't sure that he wanted to live, and Mr. Long just knew that he was suffering. Something had to be done. So one day, while in the throes of the pain of gastritis, Fitzgibbons was leaning on his fence and gazing at his chickens as they rolled in the dirt and dust and occasionally stopped to nibble sand. His thought, according to an article in the Muncie Evening Press, was, did anybody ever hear of a chicken having a tummy ache? He inquired among his poultry fancying friends, and no one had ever heard of a fowl with a painful stomach. Fitzgibbons next questioned if humans ever ate sand. No, they didn't. From these observations, he came up with 2 premises. 1, chickens eat sand and don't have stomach problems. 2, humans don't eat sand and do have stomach problems. He concluded that if human beings should eat sand, they would not have stomach trouble. Armed with that irrefutable logic, Fitzgibbons immediately incorporated sand into his diet and his stomach distress subsided. And while initially reluctant to share his discovery, Fitzgibbons did finally tell his friends Cromer and Long. Long tried the cure, and a few hours after eating sand, he said that he jumped from his bed like a 10-year-old schoolboy and single-handed threw off his premises 2 burly tramps that were threatening to burn his home if they were not fed and clothed. As to why eating sand worked on his stomach problems, Long's theory was that the principal component of sand is silicon, and silicon enters into the composition of bones in the human body. I'm not sure that this theory explains anything to me, but apparently it did to Mr. Long. The sand cure was still a well-kept secret until Fitzgibbons recommended it to a newspaper friend after extracting a promise from him that he would not tell anyone. This friend, according to Fitzgibbons, betrayed his trust not only by failing to try the same cure, but by rushing into print with the story. And that story was picked up by newspapers in Indianapolis and Fort Wayne, other cities in Indiana, and as far afield as Boston, Minneapolis, St. Louis, and Philadelphia. The 3 sand eaters were immediately besieged with letters from fellow sufferers asking for details about the sand diet. Next slide, please. Fitzgibbons gave a general recipe for the sand while saying that variations were perfectly all right. He suggested that sand should be from a lake and each grain should be rounded and about the size of a pinhead. And no worries about running out of sand. As Fitzgibbons noted, there are lots of lakes and millions of tons of sand around. Before eating the sand, he said, it should be boiled, baked, or fried. When he was asked about the advantages of different methods of preparing the sand, Fitzgibbons said that he couldn't explain it, but that baked sand agreed with some while boiled sand agreed with others. Fitzgibbons preferred his sand baked because he said, it seems to me to possess more nutriment. He also suggested that a teaspoon be taken at mealtime when the patient isn't feeling well, or in fact, just at any time. There is nothing harmful about the sand, Fitzgibbons said. It assists digestion by grinding the food. And while Fitzgibbons did prefer his sand warm, he said that eating cold sand was fine as long as it was sterilized beforehand. So once the cat was out of the bag about the benefits of eating sand, Fitzgibbons, Long, and Cromer spread the gospel, although they had to dispel the notion that sand eating might be a cure-all. It wasn't, they said, in answer to a number of queries, a cure for either cancer or tuberculosis. And while happy to share their experiences with sand, the trio did get a little testy with their correspondents who didn't take the idea of sand eating seriously. Fitzgibbons noted that although he wasn't comparing the sand eaters to these men, Galileo was laughed at and Columbus was thought insane. So next slide, please. So someone who didn't laugh at the three was Muncie socialite Harriet Mitchell Anthony, also known as Diamond Heels Hattie. Hattie was a lover of the finer things in life, including designer gowns, lavish jewelry, and travel to faraway places. And while it's hard to see in this picture, the shoes she has on do have diamonds in the heels, hence her nickname. In July 1914, Hattie sailed to Europe with 15 trunks full of gowns, ready to dazzle the citizens of France. The Indianapolis News reported that Mrs. Harriet Anthony, who went to Europe to surprise Paris with Indiana-made dresses and diamond-heeled slippers, keeps in good condition with sand from the desert. Yes, Hattie ate sand and was a member of the Muncie sand-eating cult. Along with her many trunks, Hattie carried 35 pounds of Arizona desert sand in a specially prepared receptacle. It seems that Hattie didn't adhere to the notion that lake sand was best. Again, according to that article in the Indianapolis News, Hattie was advised that desert sand was by far the best and most palatable. So she sent to Arizona for enough sand to be able to take a teaspoon before and after each meal during her long European vacation. And I don't know how long this trip lasted, but you would think that 35 pounds of sand would go a long way. And it's also nice to know that someone in Arizona was most likely making money and was happy to send sand to a gullible Munsonian. A few of Hattie's friends were surprised to learn that Hattie had joined the sand-eating craze since they had never known her to be in ill health. Instead, it was thought that she sought the sand cure as a method of improving still further a physical condition that was generally regarded as nearly perfect. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how long the sand cult lasted in Muncie and how many others might have jumped on the bandwagon. I didn't find any info on sand eating after the story about Hattie appeared in 1914, so maybe everyone was cured. I do know that Hattie lived to age 77 and Fitzgibbons, Cromer, and Long were in their 70s and 80s when they died. Maybe they found the secret to long life.
Well, thank you, Karen. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat or raise your hand and I will try to unmute you. One question I did have as a follow-up was, so was this considered a 20th century diet fad of eating sand?
I think probably most of the articles I found seem to indicate that these three men actually came up with it on their own, that Fitzgibbons did. But I found a few articles from a couple years earlier that there was also a sand eating cult in Boston. So those in Muncie may have just, followed along with the Bostonians. Anyway, it seemed to peter out pretty quickly, which, really kind of makes sense. So yes, early 20th century.
So someone asked in the chat, could this have been the start of the take a jar of sand from Muncie and ensure you will never return myth?
I don't know, could be.
I actually don't know what that myth is. I've never heard that.
Well, it's from, I would ask, I saw who asked the question, it's Augusta, so I would assume that it came from her father, Dick, that it could have been the start, and heaven knows that Hattie had lots of friends in Muncie, and she could have certainly have shared the sand eating with them. Who knows, it could have been.
All right, any other questions? Okay, we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is Melissa Gentry.
You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So the next stories take place in Muncie around 1917. The city was bustling, the country was preparing to enter World War I, women were fighting for the vote, and prohibition was on the horizon. Next slide. The city of Muncie has a history of violent clashes between wets and dries, with various referenda on the prohibition of alcohol. Muncie alternated between wet and dry leading up to prohibition in 1920. Next slide. There were dozens of legal saloons in Muncie in 1917, but at the same time, because they couldn't legally get a license, many operators of speakeasies or blind tigers, gambling houses, and brothels were paying bribes in order to keep their red light businesses running. And just an FYI, in Muncie, the red light district was centered around Walnut Street, south of the railroad tracks. Next slide. In 1919, the mayor and the prosecutor were sentenced to prison for their role in the bribery and corruption in Muncie. Police were also involved. Individual officers were getting paid to look the other way. Some got paid $100 per week per business in today's money. At the trial of the mayor and the prosecutor, the judge declared, quote, "Muncie is very largely wicked," unquote. A policeman testified that, quote, "there were blind tigers and houses of ill repute to be found every third door in the red light district," unquote. Next slide. The police would conduct raids from time to time just for show. The newspaper reports satisfied the club women who were concerned about vice, but also served as free advertising for new customers. Not much is written about the role of women during this time of corruption, but some of Muncie's most successful brothels and blind tigers were owned and operated by women. Next slide. But life for women in the red light district could definitely be eerie. And this is the story of their unfortunately creepy endings. And spoiler alert, if you're keeping score, 3 will die tragically and 3 will be jailed. Next slide. The African-American clubs were called the Blue Front in Muncie, and one of the popular spots was the 2nd Street Cabaret on the corner of Walnut and 2nd Street. The club was owned by Muncie native Frank, nicknamed Peanut Bass. Next slide. But don't let the nickname Peanut fool you. He was a violent criminal called first the bully of the red light, who became the king of the red light, who hosted political parties in his home. He had power. Peanut also had a history of arrests dating back to 1905. None affected his standing in Muncie, including assault and kicking his sister, beating his wife, immorality with a married woman in the back room of a club, and that spurned woman would later die of chronic alcoholism. And he was arrested multiple times on a charge called provoke, where he drove women to react with violence. Next slide. But the worst case related to Frank Bass provoking women to act violently happened in 1914. Rose Proctor had been living with Peanut. He called her his housekeeper, but she considered herself a common law wife. Reports of abuse were well known, but Peanut was the king. Rose Proctor was stuck. At one point, she drank poison, trying to end her life. Then at a party at their home, while sitting among friends, Rose pulled Peanut's revolver out of her pocket and shot herself in the heart. Next slide. But some African-American women in the Muncie Red Light District actually found themselves in positions of extreme wealth and influence. One such woman was Eliza Hughes. She owned this duplex on 2nd Street. And this is actually a drawing of what I think she looked like because we have no photographs of Eliza Hughes, unfortunately. Next slide. Eliza Hughes was a big news story in 1916 following a raid on her brothel / blind tiger / gambling club, or what was called an immoral resort. That prosecutor that I mentioned earlier, who would years later be indicted for bribery, was actually elected on a strict law and order platform in 1916. He hired his own constables to make raids that the police wouldn't. And thanks to that, Eliza Hughes's resort was raided half a dozen times in the spring of 1917. Next slide. Usually, Eliza would be arrested and fined, but one particularly eerie incident, one of those creepy endings, would put her under the hot light of scrutiny from the prosecutor. A notably white woman showed up at the home hospital in what newspapers called a dying condition. The prosecutor was summoned, and the woman told about her alleged treatment as a captive at Eliza's club. From the Muncie Evening Press, quote, "The record that Eliza made during her career in Muncie sparkles with sensations, but the beginning of her end came when a white woman from the Hughes Resort, who had been forcibly held for prostitution in the joint, had been taken to a hospital where she died," unquote. Next slide. The trial had outlandish testimonies, but the headline in the newspaper read, "Mighty tough on Eliza." She was fined $500, which is $10,000 today, and pocket change for her, and sentenced to 6 months in the women's prison in Indianapolis. Next slide. 2 years later, in July of 1919, Eliza Hughes was once again in the headlines because a man named Dago Watson accidentally testified that he wasn't a vagrant because he was tending bar at her club. Watson also revealed that his girlfriend, Denver, Colorado cook, nicknamed Collie, had bribed police so that he could return to Muncie and avoid any vagrancy charges. Collie lived next door to Eliza and convinced her to hire Watson to work at her club. Next slide. In a newspaper interview with Dago Watson, he hinted at just how rich these two, quote, big women, unquote, were. He said, "I saw her in Springfield, Ohio on July 3rd when she was going to the Dempsey Willard fight with Eliza. She came to the hotel where I was staying and told me she was going to the fight and asked me to go with her. She had several rings upon her finger, together with other jewelry, and she had about $900, which is $18,000 in cash today, with her. I told her that I did not want to go with her, for she was dressed like a real lady and I was clothed only as a porter." Just as an aside, boxing matches were huge in 1919, but this Jack Dempsey fight was record-breaking in scope, and it was the first ever time that women were allowed to attend the heavyweight championship. The fact that 2 African-American women from Muncie attended such a historic event is pretty remarkable. Next slide. So that autumn back in Muncie, Dago Watson and Collie were arguing at Peanut Bass's club, and Watson slapped Collie. She immediately broke up with him. Days later, Watson approached her as she was walking down 2nd Street, and Collie refused to stop. Outraged and spurned, Watson pulled out a gun and shot her 4 times in the back as she tried to run away. By the way, the arrest of 2 that it mentions here refers to the unfair fact that Collie's friend Nora, who was walking with her that day, was arrested and jailed in order to testify as a witness. Watson's defense was the old "she had it coming" excuse. In court, Watson explained, "I didn't murder her, I just shot her, and she died afterwards." He was sentenced to life in prison in March of 1920. Next slide. Collie Cook died at the age of 39, but even in death, her notable wealth was reported in the newspapers. From the December 7th, 1919 Muncie Morning Star, the estate of Denver, Colorado Collie Cook has been appraised for $6,287, which is about $140,000 today. The inventory of the appraisal of property showed that the deceased had $1,100 in diamonds, which would be $24,000 today. This was actually the McNaughton store ad that appeared on the same page as the article about Collie's estate. And it's also how I imagine Collie looking with her diamonds. Next slide. So Eliza Hughes lost her best friend in the fall of 1919. But by this time, Indiana had enacted prohibition. But Eliza was operating a club in Muncie, but also running an elaborate bootlegging network across the state. Notably, she was the boss and white men were her employees and driving her fancy cars. Unfortunately, one of her drivers was arrested with a carload of liquor in Jeffersonville and blabbed about Eliza being his boss. She was arrested but posted the hefty bond and went on the lam for a year. Next slide. In fact, federal agents in Muncie were never able to locate Eliza Hughes. They did, however, make arrests in a huge ring related to liquor and gambling charges late in 1920. This was one of the biggest busts in the country under the new prohibition laws. City officials had once again been implicated, along with lurid proprietors of pool halls, cigar stands, and other clubs. Among the defendants were 2 local attorneys, a police captain, a Warner Gear executive, a police officer, a justice of the peace, and 2 constables. And Frank Peanut Bass, King of the Red Light, was arrested. Next slide. Meanwhile, in January of 1921, more big mouth men driving Eliza Hughes's cars were detained in Muncie, and they gave the local police Eliza's address in Chicago. And then they passed it on to federal agents. Eliza Hughes was captured and held in the Marion County Jail until the spring of 1921. She was tried along with more than 50 other defendants from that Prohibition ring. The bad news is that her 6-month jail sentence in December of 1921 is the ending for this story, and her name disappeared from the newspapers. But one Muncie woman was able to exact a little revenge back in the red light district. Ruby McRae had taken the role of Peanut Bass's common law wife not long after that suicide of Rose Proctor back in 1914. But the cycle of abuse and violence with Peanut didn't change. Next slide. In January of 1921, after his arrest in that Prohibition ring, but before his sentencing, Ruby McRae found Peanut in bed with another woman at a friend's home. When Peanut tried to kick Ruby down the stairs, she pulled a gun from her coat and shot him dead. He was 36, and his obituary on the front page of the newspaper described him like a pillar of the community. Ruby was identified as his housekeeper. Ruby served 2 years in prison, but a few years after her release, Ruby remarried and lived happily ever after. Maybe.
Well, thank you, Melissa. I think we've got some questions. If other people want to add questions into the chat, go right ahead. One question I had real quick was, how many people do you think were employed by Eliza Hughes in her club?
It actually comes out in that testimony in the Prohibition ring in Indianapolis that she had police officers that she was employing to deliver alcohol to her club. And she had taxi drivers from Muncie that worked for her. And many of these men were white men, which is pretty notable to have an African-American woman that was the boss of the bootlegger. If I was guessing, I'd say at least 20. And that's not including the women who were obviously employed in other ways at her bar. So a bar/brothel. So
that would be considered a small business, I think.
Yes. Yeah, she was extremely rich, and she obviously didn't have to pay taxes.
Someone had asked in the chat what a blind tiger is, but other people had given answers that it was another word for speakeasy or a place that sells liquor illegally.
Right. I think it's more of a reference to the ones before Prohibition. These are people that just didn't have a liquor license. That's my understanding.
All right. Are there any other questions? All righty. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our last presenter, who is Sara McKinley.
Hi, everyone. I hope that you've been enjoying our eerie stories tonight. Our next story is our ghost story of the evening. Next slide, please. So tonight I'll be telling the story of Florence Bly, the librarian whose ghost is thought to haunt the old Roberts Hotel in downtown Muncie. I was always intrigued by the mystery surrounding Florence, and while digging in the archives, I found a few surprising details about her life that raised even more questions about her tragic end. Next slide. In order to understand Florence's story, we need to begin with her childhood. Florence Elizabeth Bly was born Christmas Eve, 1907, in Richmond, Indiana, to parents Peyton George Bly and Clara Smith. She had a sister, Eleanor, 3 brothers, a cousin, Mildred Lamb, and an aunt, Elizabeth May Puckett. Florence's mother, Clara, died young in 1911 of tuberculosis when Florence was only 4 years old. Next slide. 2 years later, Florence was sent away to live with her aunt and her cousin at the home of Amos Whiteley in Muncie. Florence's widowed aunt, Mrs. Puckett, was employed as manager of the household and estate of elderly, wealthy widower and Muncie industrialist Amos Whiteley Sr. Amos was the owner of Whiteley Malleable Castings Company, and the Whiteley neighborhood in Muncie is named for his older brother, William. Amos's wife, Josephine, had died of a heart attack several years prior in 1906, and Mr. Whiteley was all alone in his big house. His sons were married and living elsewhere in Muncie, so he had invited his employee, Mrs. Puckett, to bring her daughter Mildred and her youngest niece Florence to live with him at his estate. Having Florence and Mildred living in the once lonely house brought much joy to Mr. Whiteley. He wrote, quote, "I am not permitted to get lonesome, and I have no occasion to go out for amusement," end quote. He recounted the girls' accomplishments in school, their friends, and their evenings playing the piano and violin. Next slide. It sounded like a sweet story on the surface. An elderly, wealthy widower decides to raise two young girls to bring some joy back into his life and give them a better life in return. While I was researching Mr. Whiteley, however, I found some curious articles in the newspaper that made me question Florence's life in the Whiteley home. According to a Muncie newspaper article from 1908, just 5 years prior to Mildred and Florence coming to live with Mr. Whiteley, he was involved in a high-profile scandal. He was accused of seducing and having physical relations with a 13-year-old girl named Beatrice Tuttle. The court records in which the girl's mother, Carrie Tuttle Abbott, sued Mr. Whiteley go into great detail about the relationship. Beatrice's father, Matthew Tuttle, had abandoned Beatrice and her mother, leaving them in poverty. Her mother then married a Mr. Abbott, who later died of pneumonia. Mr. Whiteley then became a father figure to Beatrice and used his wealth and power to gain her favor, promising to send her to school and give financial aid. So far, it sounded very much like the life he offered to Florence and Mildred. Things may have started out innocent, but the girl's mother claimed that he would invite Beatrice into his office in the Klopfer building, which included bedchambers, and he would offer her candy and liquor before having his way with her. For 3 years, he allegedly had an affair with her, buying expensive gifts, taking her away to stay in hotels with him, and using his wealth and power to take advantage of her inexperience, loneliness, and poverty. Strangely, the court case was filed in civil court, and no criminal charges were filed. Beatrice's mother asked for $50,000 for the damages that Whiteley's affair with the girl caused to her place in society. Mr. Whiteley said Mrs. Abbott did not have enough facts to constitute a case against him. And strangely, Mrs. Abbott then dropped the case, saying that the case was brought to court without her authority, knowledge, or consent. She was then ordered to pay the court costs. The newspaper suggested that when Mrs. Abbott's second husband had died of pneumonia, he left her an alleged fortune in New York City, but the property was never located. So the question remained, was Mr. Whiteley guilty of his crime and used his wealth and reputation to have the charges dropped? Or did Mrs. Abbott make up the whole story to rescue herself from poverty? We may never know, as there was apparently no investigation into the charges and the story disappeared from the news. Next slide. So whether or not Mr. Whiteley was guilty, it seemed odd that he would take in two young girls to live with him and pay for their education just as he had allegedly done for Beatrice. The rumors must have followed about the allegations and taking in two young girls, but nothing was ever said publicly. When Mr. Whiteley died in 1925, he left his estate to Mrs. Puckett. Mildred and Florence continued living there at 906 East Adams, and the next year, Florence graduated from Muncie High School with the class of 1926. Her older sister, Eleanor, also came to live with her. Florence was her senior class's secretary and was active in Science Club, Pickwick Circle Friendship Club, Dramatic Club, and Sewing Club. Now you'll notice in the yearbook page here, I have two photos circled. One is Florence, and the other person, who looks like a young Sean Penn, is named Virgil Yockey. Virgil Yockey is actually my great-grandfather. My family had no idea until I was researching Florence that Virgil had actually graduated high school with her. Next slide. After Florence graduated from high school, she attended Earlham College in her hometown of Richmond, majoring in English and French, and graduating with the class of 1930. Next slide. She returned to Muncie after college and worked in the juvenile department of the Carnegie Library for several years. In 1933, she was named head librarian of Grace Maring Branch Library on South Madison Street. She was in the newspaper several times, highlighting library programming that she was involved in, such as her children's story times. Next slide. In 1936, Florence married John Personette Trees. John was a music teacher and a widower whose first two wives had died. He was 45 years old, and at 16 years, Florence's senior, who was 29. Florence's husband, John, appeared to have possibly been involved in a scandal similar to her father figure, Mr. Whiteley. In 1913, a man by the same name of John Trees, who was also a prominent musician and married man from Elwood, Indiana, was accused of having abducted a young woman and was arrested in Terre Haute. According to that time frame, he would have been the right age with the same name and occupation as the man Florence would later marry. In 1939, after 3 years of marriage, Florence filed for a divorce, which was granted in 1940. Next slide. 2 years following her short marriage and divorce, on October 7th, 1942, when Florence was only 35 years old, she mysteriously filed her last will and testament. 2 months later, on December 15th, 1942, she also took a 60-day leave of absence from her job at the library. Next slide. During her leave of absence, she registered at the Roberts Hotel on New Year's Day, 1943. This would have been shortly after her birthday, telling her relatives that she wished to be alone for a few days. She was reportedly despondent due to ill health and stress over the war. Hotel officials said that she often came to the hotel to stay for a period of a few days, so to them it was not unusual. 2 days after checking into the Roberts, Muncie would have its first blackout test, which would leave the city in total darkness as a practice to prevent becoming a target should the enemy try to bomb the city's factories. Next slide. While Muncie was in complete darkness during the test, Air Raid Warden Howard Scheller was patrolling his district when he discovered the dead body of Florence Bly on the sidewalk of the hotel. She had died instantly of multiple skull and neck fractures and other injuries after falling from her room on the 6th floor of the hotel. The window of her 6th floor room was found open by Police Captain Harry Butler, and within the room was a small traveling bag containing Florence's personal belongings. The door had been locked from the inside. A small handbag was also found with Florence's body, containing a card on which was written, "In case of sudden death, notify M.L. Meeks Mortuary." No note was found in her room, however. The night clerk said she had asked him for details about the blackout test that would be occurring that evening, so officials theorized that if she hadn't leapt to her death, that she may have been prepared to go out and somehow fell from the window while leaning to watch the blackout test. It was never officially determined if the death was suicide or accidental. The coroner's report on her death certificate stated death was caused by, quote, falling or jumping from 6th floor window of hotel to sidewalk, end quote. Next slide. As was directed in her note and in her will, her funeral took place at the Meeks Mortuary. The Grace Maring Library closed for the day for her funeral. Next slide. Her final resting place is in the Bly family plot at Earlham Cemetery in Richmond, Indiana. Her cousin Mildred Lamb is also buried with the Bly family. Florence's older sister, Eleanor, pictured here, continued a long, successful career as an English teacher in Muncie, and taught several courses at Ball State, where she had done her graduate work. My grandmother said that she actually had Eleanor as her speech teacher at Central, and said she was a wonderful instructor. When Eleanor retired in 1965, Muncie threw 3 retirement parties for her. 2 of them were actually held at the Roberts Hotel where her sister had perished. But that was not unusual, since the Roberts Hotel was a very popular place for receptions in Muncie. Next slide. Stories were later passed down that the ghost of Florence Bly haunts the Roberts Hotel. According to a 1987 booklet about the hotel by Frederick Graham, a mysterious figure has been seen in the window that is thought to be Florence. Quote, "This guest can be seen occasionally on dark, moonless nights when the streets near the hotel are unusually quiet. Passersby will see what appears to be a woman peering out of one of the windows. Something about this sight especially attracts and holds the eye of the beholder. Some have described it as a young woman dressed in neat, dark, schoolmarm type clothes. She will be quite motionless, and her appearance always arouses curiosity. Invariably, the thing at the window is at the window of a room not to be believed to be occupied. After each such sighting, an inspection will be made of the room where the vision appeared, but no one has ever been found. Upon repeated sightings with no explanation of the phenomena and no ill effects, it has been decided that she is a very refined ghost, the likes of which every hotel should possess. Could this apparition be the spirit of the Muncie librarian who plunged to her death from her room?" End quote. And that is our story of the ghost of Florence Bly.
Thank you, Sarah. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and add them into the chat or raise your hand. I have one follow-up, and I wanted to know what room was she staying in at the Roberts Hotel when she died?
She was staying in room 620, and often that's where the ghostly figure can be seen. And that's actually the last room on the 6th floor facing High Street.
Someone has asked in the chat, is the hotel open today?
The hotel has been turned into residential apartments in recent years, so it's not operating as a hotel anymore.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Someone had put into the chat that the 1942 Magician, which is the Muncie High School yearbook, was dedicated to Eleanor by the students.
Yes. Yeah, Eleanor was very well loved, and I think her niece, Rebecca, was also a really well-known teacher here in Muncie and well-liked. She might still be around here in Muncie, I'm not sure. But she would have been the daughter of one of Eleanor and Florence's brothers. So they all went into the sort of the education field here in Muncie. So, and I don't know what my theory of Florence is, but I have a feeling that she at least felt that her time was coming soon and she was making preparations. I don't know if she intended for it to end when and where it did, but apparently she expected it sometime in the near future.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our presentation. If there's any questions about any of the women that we've talked about, or if you have any questions for any of our presenters, this would be the time. So we would like to thank you for joining us this evening. We do plan to do another Zoom presentation about local history on December 30th, so stay tuned for more information on that. If there aren't any questions, we would like to thank you and have a good rest of your evening, and happy Halloween.
It looks like we do have one raised hand.
Do we? Let me see.
Shelley Gage.
Let me see if I can find it. 1 second. I can't see it. Sarah, can you see it?
There we go.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Go ahead, Shelley. You look like you're unmuted.
Hello. I was just going to share, my husband and I run a ghost hunting group, and so we actually did have a chance to investigate at the Roberts a couple times before it shut down as a hotel. And we did take, on one of our investigations, we took a person with us who was a sensitive. And so we asked some questions while we were in the room where Florence supposedly stayed. We could not get a straight answer out of her about whether she jumped or she fell. The main thing we got was that she liked my husband. I'm not sure why. But one of the things that got reported at that time by the head of housekeeping at the Roberts was that they would frequently have that room all tidied up and ready for the next guest, and they'd go in to check on something and find all the coat hangers strewn across the bed. Occasionally they'd have issues with the tap in the bathroom turning itself on.
Oh dear. She didn't want anybody using her room.
She was the most polite, I think, of the Roberts ghosts.
Oh, are there more?
Oh, yes. The Roberts is, in my opinion, the most haunted location in Muncie. Probably the other more infamous ghost is the gentleman that checked into room 319 during Great Depression. And the story is that he committed suicide supposedly by putting rat poison on potato chips. A story that doesn't make a lot of sense, but what they would report was that it would sound like people were tearing apart the room, and there would be nobody actually renting the room at that time, and they'd go up to check and there would be nobody there. And I saw we had somebody wanting to know how many ghosts there are in the Roberts. There are at least 3, in addition to Potato Chip Guy in Florence. They believe that Lon Thornburg, who was the longtime manager of the Roberts, was still haunting the second floor. They would occasionally experience things in the offices on the second floor, and they attributed it to him. He was a very dedicated manager. When he passed away in the late 40s, early 50s, they found all of his paychecks from the Great Depression era because he hadn't bothered to cash any of them. He wanted to make sure that the hotel stayed solvent. And
Aww.
he actually would let the staff take groceries home from the kitchen to make sure that they had food for their families. So he wasn't a presence that anybody, I think, felt was particularly malevolent. He was just he startled them a lot. There are additional reports of people seeing a gentleman on that second floor mezzanine, and he would ask for directions, or he would point directions to the men's restroom, but he was pointing to where it was before the most recent remodel. And there were also reports of some people on the 6th and 7th floor in addition to Florence that we heard about. Florence is the only one that we were ever able to actually pin down and know who she was and what happened to her, which is why I've always said she's kind of my favorite ghost, because I've got the history and the story to go with, and I don't have that for Potato Chip Guy or anyone else.
Didn't Hattie Mitchell Anthony die at the Roberts, Karen?
Yes, Hattie died at the Roberts, yeah. 1946, if I remember correctly.
Did she just die of old age there?
Yes,
or?
Yeah, yes. She had been ill for a while, and yes, she died of old age. Nothing suspicious about it.
Someone asked in the chat too, has the Bly ghost ever been reported in the apartment now?
That's what I was wondering.
I haven't heard anything. I don't know if you've heard of anything, Shelley, since it was converted.
I have not heard anything about the Bly ghost. I did have one friend that was, they're now renting office space in there, but he was using the ground floor where they have the little business hub. And he had a friend there that told him he went into the restroom one day, and while he was in the stall, he saw the shadow of somebody walking through the restroom, but there wasn't anybody else there. So I think the place is probably still active. I just don't know that we're hearing all of the stories.
I still wonder if several of them have moved here to the Carnegie Library, where I'm actually presenting from. We have weird things happen here all the time. Our elevator goes up and down on its own, and you can hear people walking across the floor when you're the only one in the building.
I like to tell people when we would do a talk on Haunted Muncie, I always like to start off by saying that Muncie is located where it is because of ghosts. There's a story that Goldsmith Gilbert was able to purchase the half of the Hackley Reserve that he used to lay out the original Muncie because Rebecca Hackley and her family were willing to sell him that section of it because they believed that portion was haunted and they wouldn't go there.
Yeah, I knew she never actually came here to the land that she owned. So maybe that's why.
Alrighty, so happy Halloween, everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed our presentation tonight, and look for more information about our presentation on December 30th. Have a good evening.
Thank you.